New Victoria 3 gameplay returns with Egypt, and also a little bit of Zulu, oddly. More on that later, but primarily, of course, we'll be focusing on Egypt. The footage is provided by these two wonderful gentlemen from Paradox Interactive. They just recently finished streaming this game, and as I like to do with the Victoria 3 footage, I thought it would be a good idea to supercut, to edit it down and show you the key moments, because for a lot of you, a 3-hour stream is simply too much, and also this one, unfortunately, happened to be filled with a few technical issues, hence the Zulu gameplay in the middle. But without any mucking around, let's jump in and take a look at all the new gameplay that we saw, and I'll try and steer you in the right direction about the things that I'm looking at and the things that they were talking about in their commentary as well. In many ways, the first part of the game and the first part of the stream was a really good introduction, kind of how to play Victoria 3, or to a lesser extent, how it might be played, how you might set up a game, finding yourself in one of literally hundreds of nations. How do you play it? In Egypt's case, they're diving in and taking a look at the different provinces, and they realize that they're soon going to be under threat from war from the Ottoman Empire. So there's not only an onus on them to start to build up this tech tree, to check through their construction in different territories. Those of you who have played Hearts of Iron 4 will be probably somewhat familiar with the system. It looks to be kind of similar. Here they're checking through their budgets, another important thing that a stately person might do, I assume. Checking through those balance books, making sure that everything lines up. You can see them adjusting different things like the taxation rate, the rate of wages. They're also looking here by the looks at in particular taxes on certain goods, trying to harvest a little more money. Speaking of harvesting, if you wouldn't mind clicking that subscribe button, I'd love to harvest you for some extra watch time down the line. Let's continue. Jokes aside, though, I do intend to cover a lot of Victoria 3 in future, and I tend to play a lot of strategy games, so you might hopefully find some value from sticking around. Speaking of sticking around, they're sticking around with Egypt for quite a bit longer yet before they bounce over to the Zulu. The next step is to look at their laws, their politics. Here they're changing their internal security, the idea being they need to bolster up a bit of strength by changing the laws to have a national guard. The other part of internal politics, of course, is who is in charge, the different interest groups. Do we have a king, a dictator, a president? Anything in between. Then they turn back once more to the regions to look back in, and now they're sort of pulling together all of the different things that they know and talking about, okay, how does this all relate together? Here we have the Sahara Desert, so we've got a little bit of extra defense. We're raising our National Guard. There is, of course, but one more thing to do, and that's to look for friends and allies. Here they are looking to Ethiopia to make some diplomatic plays with other minor nations. We'll talk a little bit more about ranking down the line where we get a closer look at that. But they're also looking at their enemy, the Ottomans, and taking a look at the different diplomatic features and stances here. I'll zoom in a little bit. You can see as they pan through to the Russians feel very differently about them. What they're looking for, of course, are allies and protectorates. And this will vary depending on whether we're playing as major nations or minor ones, our own political ideology, where we are in the world. As they look around the world to try and find allies and people to engage with, it's important to also note that they're drawing on this interests system. If you didn't see my last video, the interest system, from what they've discussed, appears to be a way that we can interact with other players or non-player entities, as it were, because of course this is largely going to be a single-player experience, although we will talk a little bit about multiplayer. They answered a couple of questions later in the video. As a single-player experience, though, you're probably going to need to find some friends in major powers if you're playing as a minor, and potentially vice versa. And of course, you need to back it up with a war stick. Here you can see they're looking into their military buildings, the barracks and so forth, and they seem to be changing the different equipment that they're producing, the way that they're producing that equipment. Their commentary was really insightful here. Basically, they said, as Egypt, as a relatively minor, relatively weak nation, here you can see they're looking through their generals to find characteristics to also suit what I'm about to describe. As a relatively minor nation with a major power coming to war with us, not only do we need friends and a stronger economy and laws and a population to support it, but we also, of course, need a military. Here they're looking at generals to try and find more defensive ones. They're trying to play to their strengths, essentially, using the military, which is more hands-off than some other Paradox titles in Victoria 3. A reminder, of course, Victoria 3 is more of a political and economic simulator at its core. Regardless, though, you can see them pick and choose different military leaders, leading from the top, again, politically simulating that military power from the top to try and pull together a defensive and, if possible, technologically advanced army. Let's not forget, a game of Victoria 3 spans from 1836 to 1936, so their definition of advanced and ours are likely to be pretty different. Either way, they're trying to pull together two things: defensive generals and good artillery. The idea being, if they can find a major power as an ally to come and defend them, they can then try and hold what they have, stall it out, defend with their advanced artillery and their defensive generals. This is the idea, and this is essentially all the different cookie cutter pieces that have come together throughout the whole start of the stream, which unfortunately, as I hinted to at the start, they had to repeat this 3 times due to an issue with the version of the game that they were using. Don't fear, when they reverted back to the stable version, the launch version, that as they talked about it, it all worked perfectly fine. But they had an issue where enacting laws was messing with the buildings or the economics of the society. It was a bit of a mess. But either way, now that they've pulled all of their different pieces together, the final thing to do is to make sure that they can produce what they need. Do they have enough iron? Do they have enough wood? Here they're looking to the British trade market and others to try and pick up the goods and resources that they need. From what they discussed, things like those key, raw resources like iron, but also things like tools that they were producing internally were really important, and something that they were in fairly short supply of. That was a general issue for the entirety of the Egyptian playthrough, really, was being in short supply of certain things. And I think that highlights the interesting role that somewhat minor powers and more minor nations can play in Victoria 3. Because let's not forget, this is simulating every single one of them. So we can jump in somewhere right up the top of the food chain or right down the bottom. It's speaking of which, there was an awkward part in the middle of the stream where the version that they were using, as I said before, wasn't quite working properly. So they decided to try and play as a different nation, before then reverting back to Egypt and it working out totally fine. The nation in question, as you can see, was Zulu. Now, this is a really fascinating one, because if you thought that the minor power plays of Egypt were interesting, well, now we've got to flip that strategy completely onto its head and try again. Here you can see them zoomed in on the region of Zululand within Zulu. A reminder, or in case you didn't notice it on screen before, I should say, Zulu is ranked 147th. The ranking in Victoria 3 pulls together a few different things. Your sort of diplomatic or international kind of soft power, the military power, and your economic power, your GDP, and how much you've got behind you. It's a pretty good reflection of your overall standing in the world, and a reasonably quick gauge, it seems at least, to rank the countries. It seems to be fairly intelligent. Of course, this is a pretty complex situation in simulation, so we would expect that. Either way, as you can see here, they're mucking around with subsistence farming, and we're really focusing a lot on core resources because, in case you're unaware, Zulu has one of the lowest standards of living and is one of the least industrialized countries that we've seen them play as. In fact, it is, I think, the least by quite some margin. So they are poised with an interesting conundrum. Do we try and industrialize, or do we play a different way? Because they'd industrialized with Egypt, and that's how you might normally play, and go figure, a game set in the Victorian era, they decided, with the support of chat, go figure, to play the crazy way. As described by them, the crazy way was to completely disband the military. Let's say, forget about it, right? We're just not going to put any resource into it. We're going to absolutely lower our taxes into the floor. We're not going to charge anybody a dime so they can keep all of their money. But we're also going to bankrupt our economy by still continuing to build and or subsidize things within it. So the idea being, you improve the quality of living, perhaps at the expense of some trade, economic taxation, development of the state, but really try and ramp up the quality of living to try and bring Zulu to as high a position of power as they can as quickly as possible. The downside, of course, is that you may be unlikely to make a lot of friends internally, passing laws. Those internal interest groups that we talked a little bit about in my last video may not necessarily be very happy with you. But boy, oh boy, could it be a very quick way to accelerate the development of a nation state? Absolutely. Before we move on to talking about war in Victoria 3, I wanted to answer a few frequently asked questions. Firstly, a lot of people had some questions in the chat, it seemed, around the events. You just saw one pop up, red tape. Victoria 3, like a lot of other Paradox games, has those random events. They pop up. They tend to be to do with your in-game decisions, right? So a lot of these ones that you will have seen will be to do with laws, things like that, the government. And often they seem to be swaying the interest or power of a certain political group, which seems to be letting them pass laws or fall in and out of favor with certain governors or generals or that kind of thing. The next one was around multiplayer, as I alluded to earlier. They did briefly talk about multiplayer during the stream. They said that their QA testers had been playing multiplayer and laughing, and that was either a very good thing or a very bad thing, they joked. But more seriously, they said that it was in a pretty good state, generally, that the multiplayer was seemed to be working pretty well. Would we see it before launch? Unlikely was the vibe that I got. But it does seem to be working ahead of launch, which is actually, I'm ashamed to say, a lot more than what many games can accomplish. So fingers crossed for that one. The final frequently asked question was around not events, but these yields up the top here, influence and money and the authority and others. These resources appear to move up and down in a similar way that something like manpower in Hearts of Iron 4 might move up and down depending on the laws of your country, the amount of population you have obviously, but also how they're being conscripted, that kind of thing. These yields move up and down in that same way and may or may not be as punishing or rewarding. It's hard to say, but it does feel very much like it fits into that broader paradox framework, if I can call it that. Lastly, let's talk about war. War never changes, although in Victoria 3 it has and does, at least in comparison to a lot of the games that people are quite rightly comparing it to other Paradox games. For example, maybe Victoria 2. Although it's important to note many a year has passed, 12 I think, since that released. Here they've just declared war or had war declared on them. That one that I alluded to at the start of the game. We are, of course, back now with the Egyptians. Thanks for coming, Zulu. We had fun playing with you for an hour or so, but now we're back to the real game. And as you can see, this is how conflict plays out in Victoria 3. You can see it playing out on screen. Now, how is it determined and decided? Well, it's not a game where we're moving in and directly controlling each and every individual unit, even armies. In this case, we're equipping our population and our units, providing, it seems, some at least orders, relatively high-level orders around whether they should proceed or defend and that kind of thing. But broadly speaking, really, the work that goes in here is the work that you should have already done with your politics and your economy and your buildings and all of that kind of thing. You should have the right generals recruited in order to swing a combat in Victoria 3 in your favor. You should ideally, of course, have potentially better weather and terrain, that kind of thing. But moreover, you need to make sure that your units are using good gear. And to do that, maybe it means that you need to trade to get access to more iron so you can build better gear. Or maybe you need to be buying fleets or arms directly from a world major power and buddying up with them. I think you can generally get the feel for how conflict plays out, although it's important to note that this was really just one example and we haven't actually seen a whole lot of gameplay footage yet. This was maybe one of the best deep dives into it outside of the developer diaries to get a feel for how it plays out in practice. Here you can see over the other side of Egypt, more fights ongoing. I'd note up the top right, the game speed is on 4 at the moment. 4 out of 5 by the looks. So it's moving fairly quickly. You can see a day's passing roughly once every 1 to 2 seconds maybe. And you can get a feel by that slider for how quickly the battles are playing out and whether the aggressor is winning or not. I think that war and combat in Victoria 3 is one of the more controversial elements, at least it seems to be, from the comments that I've read and from my own videos where I've discussed Victoria 3 and been met with some interesting criticism at times. I think it's important to always remind ourselves and reframe ourselves that this is at its heart a political and economic game, where perhaps we might reflect on Crusader Kings as being a game about dynasty and characters. We might reflect on Hearts of Iron 4 as being a game about geopolitical conflict. I think that Victoria 3 fits, certainly it seems, more into the niche, much more so, of political and economic simulation. And then the military simulation comes through as a part of that, but not as a core primary focus. Thank you very much for joining me. Victoria 3 is hopefully coming very soon. I think it has a release date of the 25th of October, and I'll be sure to be checking it out then. See you next time.